Welcome to the Dare to Know podcast. I'm your host, Fabian Korver. Today we will be joined by Robert Hanna. Robert Hanna is an independent philosopher, co-director of the online philosophy mega project, Philosophy Without Borders, and director of the contemporary Kantian philosophy project. He received his PhD from Yale University, USA in 1989 and has held research or teaching positions at the University of Cambridge, UK, the University of Colorado at Boulder, USA, the University of Luxembourg, LU, PUC-PR Brazil, Yale, and York University, CA. He has authored or co-authored 140 plus articles or book reviews and 11 books, including Kant and the Foundations of Analytic Philosophy, Kant, Science and Human Nature, Rationality and Logic, Embodied Minds in Action, In Defense of Intuitions, a New Rationalist Manifesto, Cognition, Content and the A Priori, the first 4 volumes of The Rational Human Condition, and his most recent work, The Mind-Body Politic. Professor Hanna, welcome to the Dare to Know podcast.
All right, thank you very much, Fabian, for inviting me.
Yeah, so today I would like to talk mostly about the question on how we ought to approach and interpret Kant, Immanuel Kant's work. I know that you have written several articles focused on this question or related to this question, so I'm very looking forward to discussing this kind of questions and topics with you. So
me too.
Let's dive right into it. So you start one of your books by a quote of Charles Taylor stating, "Philosophy and the history of philosophy are one. You cannot do the first without also doing the second. Otherwise put, it is essential to an adequate understanding of certain problems, questions, issues, that one understand them genetically." A similar quote that I actually came across from Wilfred Sellars states in the Kantian spirit, "Philosophy without the history of philosophy, if not empty or blind, is at least dumb." So what is the relevance of this quote to your book, and how does this exemplify the only way of doing proper philosophy for you?
So the Taylor quotation and also the Sellars quotation that you found say explicitly that it's a necessary condition, although Taylor says essential, but in any case, that it's a necessary condition of doing philosophy per se, that we also do the history of philosophy. And I think in that particular book, Kant, the Foundations of Analytic Philosophy, but certainly again in my other book on Kant and in later work, I've emphasized that not only do I accept the Taylor-Sellars thesis about the need to contextualize and give a genetic account of philosophical views, but also that the connection goes in the other way. So, which is a little more, I think, shocking to perhaps historians of philosophy who sometimes think that they're somehow, by virtue of being historians of philosophy, are somehow released from doing philosophy per se. And so what I want to insist is that philosophy is an integrated enterprise that has a necessary historical component, which is not to say that it's in any way, I don't take a strong historicist view of any kind where somehow philosophical views are reduced to historical conditions or to social conditions, in historical frameworks. But I do think that it's at least a partially constitutive feature of all philosophy that it's not in the eternal present and it's not, disconnected from, either historical connections or even contemporary social or political connections. And so in order to contextualize philosophy, you have to look at its history and you have to look at social political connections at the same time in order to do historically oriented philosophy properly. For instance, the study of Kant, I think philosophers also have to pay close attention to contemporary debates and also think seriously about philosophical methodology and also be doing, frankly, systematic constructive philosophy as well. And then the overall project of doing, philosophy as synoptic reflection on the rational human condition, which is the way I think of it, or whatever your own systematic view of philosophy is, you've got to take into account historical work. And so in a way it annoys, it's designed, not designed, but as it happens, it annoys people who are ahistorical, and the analytic tradition has tended to be that way. On the other hand, it annoys people who are merely historicists because they don't think there's a somehow, synoptic perspective that philosophy can take. And I guess now this would be the third hand. No, but anyway, on the third hand, it also annoys historians who may think of their activity as merely an exercise in the history of ideas. Not that I have any problem with the history of ideas. It's just that it seems to me that that's not, the history of ideas does not in any way exhaust even the history of philosophy, much less philosophical activity. Yeah.
And you also talk about the no deep difference thesis that kind of relates to this basically, and also
Yes.
kind of by thinking about that, so maybe you can briefly explain also what you mean by this thesis, but also by thinking through that kind of thesis, you also kind of think about, okay, where should we head? Where is philosophy heading basically? What direction is it going into? And you specifically actually mentioned in one of your articles 3 distinct directions that you kind of see. And you urge kind of people, in some sense, at least how I read it, to go into the third direction. So to mention them, the first one is kind of the experimental philosophy direction. The second is the analytic metaphysics direction. And the third is called the two-way Kantian direction. And you kind of argue in some sense that we ought to go for the third direction. So how do you evaluate these 3 options, and why ought we to go for the third direction?
Yeah, so the no deep difference thesis is really just a very, it's just a one sentence formulation of what I was just talking about, namely that there's no essential difference between the history of philosophy and philosophy. Although I should say, as a side comment, there are of course lots of accidental differences that are reflected in, say, disciplinary subdivisions within philosophy. And so anyone who, as it were, was hired into a quote unquote history of philosophy position at a university or a college is expected to do a certain kind of philosophy, and anyone who is hired into a position that's, strictly, by label, strictly analytic philosophy or some sub part of analytic philosophy is not expected, and in fact would be criticized for spending too much time on the history of philosophy. So I'm not by any means denying, although I have problems with that way of looking at things, but that's, that would lead us into a larger discussion of the professionalization of academic philosophy and the subdivisions within it. So I think the one thing that I want to say is that the no deep difference thesis is both a thesis about making a claim about, substantive claim about the content and the methodology of proper philosophy or real philosophy. It's also intended as at least implicitly, a criticism of the way that professional academic philosophy, contemporary philosophy, is organized. And that, in a way, is a segue to the second part of your question, which is, so in contemporary philosophy, there do tend to be these divisions between history of philosophy, analytic philosophy, so-called continental philosophy. And those divisions are very sharply defined in a professional sense, and we can get more into this later. I don't think that there are, if the conception of philosophy, as I've described it, is true, then there really are no fundamental differences. There are no essential differences between philosophy done in a so-called analytic mode, philosophy done in a historical mode, philosophy done in a so-called continental mode. And then, of course, there's the more general question, or more fundamental question, I think, for me. Where does the study of Kant fit into all of this? And it's certainly the case that in my 2 books on Kant, I've tried to trace the origins of both the analytic tradition, stemming from the late 19th and through the 20th century and into the 21st century, and the continental tradition, understood originally, at least in terms of phenomenology and specifically existential phenomenology, but certainly the phenomenological tradition, have their origins in a much longer Kantian tradition, and more specifically in the neo-Kantian, 19th century neo-Kantian tradition. And then in order to understand those aspects of contemporary philosophy, or those trends, or sub-practices within contemporary philosophy, you'd need to understand, and not just in an antiquarian way, but critically understand this longer Kantian tradition. And then I guess the third part of that whole package is a thought that if we then go back to Kant, and this is really where my work started after graduate school, my thought was, well, I wanted to understand the analytic tradition adequately. I was also trained in continental philosophy, as well as analytic philosophy and in the history of philosophy. And I never could quite figure out why I was supposed to choose one of these as opposed to another, and then figured out finally it was just a social institutional thing. But in order to figure out what kind of philosopher I really wanted to be, I started studying the Kantian origins of all of these, of the analytic and phenomenological traditions. And then it seemed to me, it became clear to me that if philosophy was to move, contemporary philosophy was to move beyond what is supposedly a sharp divide, maybe even a gap between the analytic tradition and the continental tradition, the most effective way of doing it would be to go back and look at Kantian philosophy, Kant's philosophy, also Kantian philosophy, post-Kantian philosophy and the post-Kantian tradition, and try to rethink it from the ground up. Mm-hmm. So that wouldn't involve merely studying Kant, of course, studying Kant's views and trying to figure out what Kant himself held, but it would also involve a critical engagement with Kant's philosophy. And if necessary, Kant gets it wrong, saying Kant gets it wrong, but trying to move beyond, using broadly Kantian ideas to move beyond the current, impasse, I think, at least in a professional sense, between the analytic and continental traditions. And so my, as it were, world historical thought there is that, a new kind of Kantian philosophy could in fact work well, and it would make sense from a historical point of view to be a philosophy, or be a candidate for being the philosophy of the future. I mean, by the future, I mean the next 40 years, let's say, but to project beyond that, of course.
Yeah, so that's very interesting indeed. So philosophy is demarcated in some sense, and you're saying if we take this more holistic approach, and it's a two-way street in some sense. Of course, we're looking at the contemporary context, but we also are looking at the historical context, and what can we learn from each other, and how can we build it up from the ground. That's kind of what you're, how you're approaching philosophy, basically. Yeah.
Yes, and frankly, the most exciting part of it for me, in a way, is the constructive and systematic part of it, which is what does a philosophy of the future, what would a philosophy of the future look like, and what would a Kant-inspired but not, orthodox, textually orthodox Kantian philosophy, how could you work such a philosophy out? And I've spent a lot of time in the last, 10, 15 years trying to develop, through various books and articles and so on, just such a philosophy. It's Kant inspired, but it's by no means, I don't find myself tied to the texts in the sense of, and it's also true that once you study the tradition of Kant scholarship, even the phrase tied to the texts is problematic, because of course there have been many different takes on Kant, many different interpretations of Kant within the Kantian tradition. And so even that is up for grabs. And so would be part of this enterprise, as it were, engaging with other people who have worked in the Kantian tradition, but then over and above that, developing Kantian philosophy together with obviously other approaches to philosophy and so on, towards something new and frankly better than what we have now.
So yeah, focusing on Kant, like you make a claim also that Kant's Critique of Pure Reason is arguably the most important book in modern philosophy. So of course, then it will be a very important starting point for all of us on kind of how to.
Yes, if that's true. Although, exactly. In fact, sometimes I took that for granted, when I started working on this material. But I have occasionally encountered philosophers who, particularly in the Hegelian tradition, who seem to think that, actually it's Hegel that's, the beginning of the analytic tradition and so on. So there is a kind of sub-debate between, roughly speaking, between post-Kantians or Kant, people who work on Kant and people who work on Hegel, as to whether it's the Kantian beginning. I mean, they wouldn't deny that Hegel's philosophy in some sense flows from Kant, but I think they typically think of it as involving a sharp break from Kant, and then the post-Kantian tradition starting primarily from the Hegelian tradition. So even that's one of these, issues that's up for grabs. so, but I do think most people who study philosophy would agree that in the Western tradition, at least, the big four are Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, and Kant. I mean, of course, you could have disagreements about whether that should be a larger list or not, but I don't think that unless you're trying to somehow undermine the canon of Western philosophy itself, and certainly some people are attempting to do that as well, but at least prior to that canon-busting enterprise, Kant would be the most important. I think it just to be true that most people who study this would say that Kant is the starting point of contemporary philosophy.
And if we zoom in on Kant, so you have one article called The Three Phases of Kant: the boogeyman,
Right.
the orthodox, and the radical. So you talk about these different phases. So it's kind of catchy title, I would say. So what are the phases? Can you maybe describe the differences and kind of lay it out?
Okay, so as you pointed out, I distinguish between Kant, the bogeyman, who is which is a caricature of Kant, or actually a set of caricatures of Kant that have taken various forms. But anyway, they're highly critical of Kant, and they tend to present Kant as a straw man of some kind or another, a caricature. And then there's the orthodox Kant, which is the Kant that has flowed from the Kant scholarship tradition, and also the tradition of not merely Kant scholarship, but Kantian philosophy more broadly speaking. And that has tended to have a center at the leading universities of the day, from the late 18th century through the 19th century and into the 20th and now into the 21st century. And then in opposition to both the bogeyman, the set of caricatures and negative approaches to Kant, and the orthodox Kant with all the various aspects or various subphases within the orthodox Kant, then I oppose what I call a radical Kant. And there has been a tradition right back to the 18th century of certain takes on Kant that didn't fit into either of those other pigeonholes, but have pushed Kant in a way that you might call involving strong readings. And the literary critic Harold Bloom has talked about, he just died recently, but has talked about strong readers of literary texts, but also historical texts, where the reading of the text may be questionable in some narrow hermeneutics, very narrow hermeneutic sense, but it's based on some aspect of the text or some aspect of a view, and it pushes it more to the limits than the original philosopher or the original writer expected. And so a good example of that would be, say, Schopenhauer's reading of Kant, which is, it's definitely in the neo-Kantian tradition, but it's an extreme view, turning, the noumenal world, the world of things in themselves, into the will. And then the will is this, well, I won't go into full account of Schopenhauer, but in any case, it's an extremely unusual and striking view of Kant. It's by no means based fully on the text, but it's had a tremendous fruitful influence on philosophers, both not just philosophers, but also writers and scientists and so on, outside the narrow Kantian tradition. And so has produced, for instance, Schopenhauer had tremendous influence on Nietzsche, and Wittgenstein, the early Wittgenstein, really knew his Kantian philosophy through Schopenhauer, and this had a tremendous influence on the Tractatus. And the Tractatus, of course, played a huge role in the initiation of the analytic tradition. And so these unorthodox radical readings of Kant, and that's only one of them, but these unorthodox radical readings of Kant have had tremendous philosophical impact, I think. And so my idea is to develop, in addition, over and above the, obviously not an anti-Kantian view, but an orthodox view. It's now time for us to develop, creative, strong readings of Kant as well, and strong readings of the Kantian tradition.
Yeah.
And
And
that
also,
way into this philosophy of the future.
I see. So, and if you have these strong readings, indeed, sometimes because it, for example, goes from Schopenhauer to Wittgenstein, etc., you don't even realize that there are these Kantian roots, and that's also one task to actually figure out if there are those roots and what those roots are, because sometimes they might not be immediately obvious because they go through another person.
That's right.
Okay,
Yeah.
that makes sense. And you talk about these strong readings, and you kind of say also within the orthodox Kant tradition, there are mostly three of these strong readings. So I'm not sure if they all can be categorized as kind of strong readings, but you talk about the psychologically oriented readings, the epistemologically oriented readings, and the metaphysically oriented readings. Are those strong readings, or are those? Is this a different kind of overview?
Yeah. Well, my thought there was that those three kinds of readings are more characteristic of the orthodox Kantian tradition. And so, looking just at the tradition of Kant scholarship and, broadly speaking, neo-Kantian philosophy, since the end of the 18th century, and in cycles, interesting cycles, there have been focuses on Kant's theory, particularly in the Critique of Pure Reason, but also developed in the practical, his theoretical philosophy, his epistemology, his metaphysics, and his theory of cognition. There have also, and these approaches have also shown up in work on his practical philosophy, and in particular his ethics. But in any case, the psychological or psychologistic approach sees Kant's contribution, great original contribution to the early modern into late modern philosophical tradition to be a new view of the human mind. And then and also along with that, a new view of how the human mind actually contributes to the nature of the world as we experience it.
Yeah.
But the thought there is that it's mainly Kant's conception of the mind that's the original part of it. And so it's a psychological view in a broad sense. And that view has been opposed to, within the Kantian tradition, and interpreters of Kant, amongst the interpreters of Kant, has been opposed to an epistemological reading, which thinks of the first critique of pure reason, but also what Kant is doing in his theoretical philosophy, as mainly an enterprise in asking about whether we have adequate responses to certain kinds of epistemic skepticism, that is to say, skepticism about our claims to knowledge, and then offering a new kind of theory of knowledge, a new kind of justification for knowledge claims. And so working mainly within a knowledge-oriented tradition. And it's certainly it's certainly the case that when I first started studying Kant, the epistemological reading of Kant was the one that had dominated for quite a few years, and it was very strong in the classical neo-Kantian tradition as well. But ever since, also as a third tradition of interpretation, many philosophers, and certainly in Kant's day, many philosophers read Kant as neither a psychologist of some kind, a new kind of psychologist or a new theorist of knowledge, but in fact, as someone who was not only, as it were, tearing down classical metaphysics, offering a critique of classical metaphysics and pulling it apart, and therefore doing something very, as it were, philosophically dangerous and radical, but also offering a brand new kind of metaphysics according to which the world itself, or at least the world as we experience it, which is the only world that, according to Kant, we have, direct cognitive access to, or even indirect cognitive access to, such that we can have knowledge about it, is dependent in some very strong way on the nature of the human mind itself. It's sometimes even interpreted in a solipsistic way, as if it depended on a single mind. In any case, all the philosophical views which now go under the rubric of idealism to flow mainly from Kant, and then previously to Kant, in some sense from Berkeley. But many philosophers think of Kant as a sort of spin, a new spin on Berkeley's idealism. And then there's a question as to whether there's another world in itself, outside of a relationship to the human mind. And so there's been great speculation and interpretive conflict about what Kant's take on, the existence or existence and nature of such a world might be. And people have offered realistic readings of Kant, where Kant asserts the existence of such, a world outside the world of human experience. And then there have been those who've denied that. and those are primarily metaphysical debates about what the nature of the world is, what the nature of, the connection between mind and world is, and so on. And those debates have, cycled in and out of the Kantian tradition, Kant interpretation tradition all along as well.
And actually, you also mentioned kind of this wide variety of interpretations that you just mentioned. You also label that kind of as the internal Kant wars. So
yes,
that's quite an interesting notion to have. So maybe you talk about different positions in that and kind of what they're fighting about. So maybe highlight like a few of those that are extremely relevant to these kind of internal Kant wars.
Yeah, so just let me look at, so I have a list of them. Let's see here. Yeah, so yeah, there are a number of them. I think probably the primary one, the one that was raised most early on in the set of critical responses that emerged within Kant's lifetime and has persisted ever since, as a set of questions, is just what I was talking about before. So Kant draws a sharp distinction between what he calls, or well, two kinds of objects in the world. One, roughly speaking, appearances or phenomenal objects, which are objects that stand in relation to human mind and human cognition and human experience. And his claim there is such objects depend on the nature of the human mind and perhaps even on the existence of the human mind, so that if human minds went out of existence, they would go out of existence as well. That's one possible claim. In addition to those objects, Kant also talks about what he calls objects in themselves, or things in themselves, things as they are or might be, altogether independently of some relation to human cognition and human subjectivity. And those objects have their nature or their essence in what's sometimes called a lonely way, in the sense that they can exist even if we do not exist, or even if any kind of mind does not exist, and would have their nature altogether independently of human cognition. Now, at the very least, what Kant says is we have no direct knowledge of such objects. What we have direct knowledge of, or direct cognition of, is only appearances and never things in themselves. At the same time, he seems, at least in a lot of texts, quite a few texts, to posit the existence of these objects which apparently we can't know anything about, including their existence, in order to, as it were, initiate the critical philosophy, that is to initiate his view of the nature of human knowledge or cognition and so on, and the nature of the world in the Critique of Pure Reason. And so right from the very beginning, some people have claimed that, without the thing in itself, you can't get into Kant's philosophy, but the thing in itself, you can't get out of it either. And so that there are contradictions that, and interpreted, when Kant is interpreted in that way, there are, they're just long-standing problems. So that's one sort of line of thinking about Kant. Now, flowing out of that line, there are stronger approaches and weaker approaches to the idealistic component, the thought that somehow, the object of human cognition or the object of human experience is dependent on the mind. And certainly, even during Kant's lifetime, philosophers like Fichte and then following on from Fichte and Schelling, another contemporary of Kant's, into the Hegelian tradition, there came to be the view that you could fix the big problems in Kant, the big problems about noumenal entities and also other fundamental problems in Kant, by taking a more radical view about mind dependence, such that the world itself, independently of, there would be no world in itself whatsoever. All there is consciousness, human consciousness, or even some larger kind of consciousness shared in or somehow partially accessed by human mind, and that the world as a whole is somehow an expression of the unfolding of the life of a single consciousness, a single, you might call it a mind, over and above individual minds. And that thought played itself out through the through the absolute idealist tradition. And I would say that, there have been lots of other worries about Kant's view. For instance, his analytic synthetic distinction had a tremendous impact on the on the analytic tradition, not surprisingly, given its name. And also his notion of the a priori and his distinction between the a priori and a posteriori modes of cognition, but also modes of justification, and also a priori and a posteriori propositions and statements, different kinds, and trying to figure out, precisely what those terms mean and how they relate not just to knowledge, but also to claims about truth and so on. And Kant's views on logic have been a constant source of controversy throughout the tradition. And this is all just in theoretical philosophy, leaving aside issues about his practical philosophy, which of course have had tremendous, they've been points of controversy, but also they've had tremendous impact on ethics and post-Kantian and contemporary ethics and moral philosophy, and also his political philosophy. And so debates, roughly speaking, Kant-oriented debates within those enterprises as well. But I think probably so one time I was traveling, I was on a road trip, and I had a flat tire, and I was standing around at a gas station waiting for someone to show up to fix my flat tire. And I got into a conversation with a college student. And the first thing he said to me once he figured out I was a philosopher and had worked on Kant was, he said, "So does the thing in itself exist or not? And if so, does it have causal powers or not?" And so this is someone who probably had done an intro course or something like that. But this was one of these big questions that, it just came into his mind as one of the first questions about Kant. And it's certainly one of those questions that has been debated over and over and over again, and different conceptions of the phenomenon, noumenon, appearances, thing in itself, distinction. And I suspect that if you walked into any introductory philosophy class that was touching on Kant at all, or in any class on Kant at all, that would be one of the things that would be debated still.
Yeah, I think similar, related to that, actually, in like the practical sphere, I think most people that do an introduction class, they also come up with the question like, so can I lie? Or can I never lie?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a similar sense.
Exactly. Yeah, so it's like the murder. Yeah, and this in itself is something that's interesting about the Kantian tradition, is that not only have there been a series of caricatures, or what I would regard as caricatures of Kant, that have been used to criticize Kant's philosophy, usually unfairly, but also for self-interested reasons of the critics. There have also been, and I think this is not true of most other, even the most famous philosophers, but somewhat true of Descartes and somewhat true of Plato, perhaps. But there's a set of, what would you call them, kind of knee-jerk isn't quite the right word, but stereotypical problems and stereotypical objections that come up over and over again. And the murderer at the door objection to Kant's ethics is one of the ones that comes up over and over and over again. I remember one time when I was teaching Kant, or this isn't just one time. I used to teach this course year after year, but over and over and over again, I would introduce the Kant ethics portion of it by laying out Kant's views. And then I'd say, so now I'm going to talk to you about the classic objection to Kant, the murderer at the door objection. And so students would say, oh yeah, that refutes Kant. And then I would say, well, actually, and then I do this, 20-minute spiel about interpreting the text in which Kant actually talked about that problem. And then I said, even over and above what Kant himself said, we can approach the problem in this way, that there's an adequate response. I won't trot out what I take to be the adequate response, where it turns out not to be the case that, we have to tell the truth and open the truth to the murderer at the door, and therefore allow the murderer to come in and murder the person, the friend, or the person you're hiding in, the innocent person you're hiding in the house. But in fact, we're not only permissible, but in fact, obligatory to lie to the murderer at the door. And so whole hour goes by, or maybe it's even 2 classes, go away for the weekend, you come back the next Tuesday or whatever it is, and I say, so what were we talking about last time? And inevitably somebody would put up their hand and say, well, we were talking about how the murderer at the door problem refutes Kant's ethics. What?
So you're not getting rid of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's just so lodged as a stereotype.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, characteristic of negative responses to Kant, is that it's extremely hard to make the stereotypes go away. I think because they're introduced so early in one's philosophical career, as an undergraduate student, or even as a high school student, or even if you're not studying Kant online, if you read a book on, almost inevitably, if it's on Kant's ethics, the first thing, or amongst the things that get trotted out, are those kinds of objections. And they, in a way, I think, because they seem so comfortable as an objection, people don't want them not to be a good objection. They feel kind of anxious if you say, well, in fact, that's not Kant's view, but then, because then it crumbles, their stereotype of Kant crumbles, and then they'd have to rethink their views on the issues, which is always a bit of a strain.
And so how do we overcome this? So of course there are these challenges and this characterization. So how do we overcome this? And I think you also talk about how do we kind of become the radical Kant. so what's the strategy forward, and what are some maybe main points that you're trying to emphasize in order to kind of succeed in that challenge?
Yeah, well, in general terms, I think and this goes back to what I was talking about, or what we were talking about right at the beginning of the conversation, which is, so if we're engaged in an enterprise, call it philosophy, love of wisdom, defined, let's say, in the way I just did very quickly, as synoptic reflection on the rational human condition in a thoroughly non-ideal natural and social world, constrained by logic, but not altogether driven by logic. And then there are other features as a critical enterprise of that sort. Then we're not going to be, it seems, so bedazzled either by the textual set of sources themselves, bedazzled in the sense that we would want to just trot out, say, Kant phrases or Aristotle phrases or Plato phrases in, response to any philosophical problem, as though quoting from a text somehow, solve the philosophical problem. First of all, we would want to read classic texts, or even contemporary texts, critically, in the sense that we'd want to, as Kant says in another famous essay, What is Enlightenment? We would dare to think for ourselves, and dare to think critically, or dare to know. And so we wouldn't be inclined to think that, well, the text is the be-all and the end-all anyway. For if there are problems, and what we're trying to do is philosophy, and not just defend Kant or interpret Kant, or just defend some philosopher, or defend some tradition, then we should be prepared to say, well, Kant had, roughly speaking, Kant or Aristotle, but in this case, Kant had an interesting idea, which I think is an insight into the rational human condition for this reason, that reason, and the other reason. It's also the case that perhaps over here in another text, Kant contradicts himself, or Kant overlooks the very insight that he had over on these pages. But we don't need to, we can note that, we should note that Kant himself developed, an inconsistent view. But if what we're trying to do is develop a synoptic conception into the rational human condition, then we can dump any part of Kant, that we think we need to dump if it's not consistent with our own take on the truth, or, not our own, not just personally, but as a intersubjective group of philosophers or people in society or something like that. We can just, it seems to me, if we're doing philosophy, we can just reject those aspects of Kant and say, well, and if Kant had, just dumped that other aspect, how might he develop a view? We can also combine views. You can say, well, Wittgenstein had this tremendous insight into this. Kant didn't quite see it that way, but Kant was just wrong about that.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So you don't feel like these boundaries are kind of pushed on you. You kind of feel like, of course, we're doing Kant and kind of Kant's thought, but there's also much more to it. And that's kind of what philosophy is about. So it also kind of go back to what is philosophy and what is the activity of philosophy and what are our aims with philosophy that kind of come into play. And you seem to have kind of a broad definition in that sense, that you don't necessarily feel limited. Kind of anything that would help us in our task of doing philosophy is in some sense permitted. Is that
absolutely. Yeah, because that's what we're trying to do. And my view, I've just in a couple of times briefly glossed what I take philosophy as, but there's another aspect to it, which is I think a little more radical even than, the one that I presented, I think, is a sort of philosophia perennis kind of view, so kind of a classical within the early modern tradition, and going back to Plato and the Greeks as well. But I also think that philosophy should change our lives. Now, it seems to me, and then in like a Marxist, I also think that, philosophy just isn't about interpreting the world. The point is to change it. But I do also think that in order to change it in the right way, and this is political activity and social activity and so on, and personal, agency and so on, we also need to examine ourselves and undergo, roughly speaking, the process of what Kant called enlightenment, to change our lives. And then once we've changed our lives in the right way through that kind of reflection and changes in commitment and thinking about various things, then we might be in a position to act in the right way as well. And so it seems to me that synoptic reflection account that I gave initially should flow naturally into personal transformation and existential themes in philosophy, and then into the political as well. But if that's what we're trying, if that's what we're really trying to do as philosophers, and that's what makes philosophy, relevant ever since anyone was capable of reflecting on things and discussing them and writing about them, then the fact that, Kant says this over here and Kant says that over there, and they don't quite fit, which, it's interesting when you're trying to figure out how texts hold together, is a relatively trivial matter. And we shouldn't in any way feel ourselves constrained to somehow, just crank out Kant texts or texts of any other, Quine for that matter. We shouldn't just, if Quine's wrong, he's wrong. We should be trying to construct our, a positive, negative view, but also a positive view as well, and not find ourselves beholden to any, set of views that are in effect operating like, dogmas or, as the Marxists would say, hegemonic ideology. We just should be sensitive to the influence of those and be trying to criticize that and liberate ourselves from that as well.
That's very interesting. So that also emphasizes kind of the personal activity and the personal aspect. And one of the things that I also noticed, you talk actually about like philosophical activism, as a term. So, it kind of relates to what you've just been discussing, but maybe again, elaborate a little bit more on how this term philosophical activism kind of jumps in and what kind of enterprise that is?
Well, it seems to me that this philosophical activism, I think, is probably one way of glossing what I just talked about, namely the way that critical philosophical reflection of at least in part, theoretically constructive sort, but also searching for insights into our own nature and the nature of the world around us and our relation to the world around us would then flow into a personal transformation, or at least basically trying to become, mature in the rational human sense, and then into, broadly speaking, social political activity. But it seems to me I have my own views about what kind of social political activity we should be thinking about and engaging in. But it seems to me that different ways of approaching that, different people and also different ways of approaching that might lead to different kinds of political activity. And so just to take an example, not all of us are really well suited to being, roughly speaking, socialist. Let's say it's socialism or a form of anarchism, or in my case, anarcho-socialism. But not all of us are really set up as people to be marching and storming barricades or setting up barricades. I mean, it might, under some conditions, come to that, or to be that kind of on-the-ground political organizer. Although, again, in some cases, it might come to that. It wouldn't be ruled out. But there could be various other ways, it seems to me, like writing about it in certain ways, discussing it with people, creating philosophy groups of various kinds. So, it's not very big, but it's sort of an international philosophy group called Philosophy Without Borders that, we don't have much money, but we try to do various things. So, and someone might say, oh, well, that's, in a way, that's pathetic. You're not out there, helping to form American foreign policy or domestic policy or something like that, or stopping global climate change. But on the other hand, conversation, activism of a more, explicit sort, marching, going house to house, it's something. It's better. It's much, much better than nothing, and just giving up because it seems like, too huge a task for any one person or any even small group that has, an income of $100 a month could ever manage. Nevertheless, philosophical activism would lead to activities of some sort or another, even if they turned out, not to be massive political,
Yeah. But we don't have to choose necessarily one avenue. You're saying, okay, there are several avenues, and this is one way how we contribute. Are there many other ways? Yes, of course. But kind of yes. Everyone is taking their approach and contributing in some way. And
yeah, absolutely. We shouldn't be dogmatic about what might be the best way for an individual, but also we shouldn't be dogmatic from up front about what might be the best way for groups of people to be engaging too, because it might turn out to be the case that, let's say, suppose there were some forum for philosophical discussion and people from all over the world engaged in it. And it wasn't just people shouting at each other over the internet, but it was something more constructive. Well, 10 years later, or 5 years later, or 5 weeks later, or 5 days later, that might actually have an impact in someone's life and then change someone else's life. And there could be a snowball effect.
Yeah.
And so even something that started in seemingly as benign's not really the right word, but seemingly small way could have larger snowball effects. And so, if philosophers are trying to do this, then as a group, as a large group, then the impact would be could be quite important.
In the next episode of the Dare to Know podcast, we will be discussing, together with Robert Hanna, the sensibility first approach, conceptualism versus non-conceptualism, and the effect of reason.